Let's talk about a single year. A year that starts with one side on the very edge of total victory, dominating entire continents and oceans. But then, imagine that same year ending with all their momentum completely shattered and the path to their ultimate defeat basically set in stone. Well, that year was 1942, and what happened in those 12 months, it changed the course of history forever. You know, for the Allies, the first half of 1942 was just an absolute nightmare. A relentless string of defeats all across the globe made it feel like the war was already lost. So, how on earth did it all fall apart for the Axis? How did they pull back from the brink? That's the puzzle we're going to solve. This quote really gets to the heart of our story today. It suggests that the fate of a war is often sealed long before the last shot is ever fired. And for the Axis powers, this means that even as they were celebrating these incredible victories in early 1942, the fatal flaws in their strategy were already guaranteeing their doom. To really understand the massive turnaround of 1942, we first have to get our heads around the inexplicable gamble that kicked it all off just a few weeks earlier. Japan's attack on the United States. I mean, it's been called a kamikaze effort on a national scale. It was a move that, from the outside, just looked completely self-destructive. So, why did they do it? Well, it was a chain reaction, really, one born out of sheer desperation. See, Japan was bogged down in this incredibly costly war in China that they just couldn't seem to win. And to keep that war going, they needed resources, especially oil. So when the US hit them with a total oil embargo in July 1941, Japan was completely backed into a corner. With only about 2 years of oil reserves left, they had a choice, either slow submission or a single desperate roll of the dice. They chose war. And here's the really crazy part. Japan was fully aware of this massive industrial mismatch. Their own analysts calculated that their naval strength, compared to the US, would just plummet from about 70% to a hopeless 30% by 1944. I mean, think about that for a second. They were knowingly starting a war of attrition against an industrial giant they knew they couldn't possibly outproduce. And this right here, this just illustrates the whole paradox. In August of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Japan's own military analysts came to their leaders with a blunt, unavoidable conclusion. Victory against the United States was impossible. The government heard this crystal clear warning and chose to attack anyway. But, despite this absolutely flawed strategic foundation, the initial Japanese assault was terrifyingly effective. In early 1942, it honestly seems like their insane gamble might just pay off, as Allied defenses across the entire Pacific just collapsed with shocking speed. All right, so let's trace this advance on the map here. From Siam and Malaya, Japanese forces just pushed south and east. They had every advantage, surprise, strategic initiative, and battle-hardened troops going up against these scattered and unprepared Allied garrisons. The dominoes just started to fall one after another, so fast. First up was Hong Kong, a key bastion of the British Empire in Asia. It held out for just over 2 weeks, surrendering on Christmas Day, 1941. And then, the unthinkable happened. The fall of Singapore. For the Allies, this was way more than a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe. This so-called impregnable fortress, the very symbol of British power in Asia, was captured in a campaign so fast, it just left the world stunned. And finally, by early March, the Dutch forces on Java surrendered. And with that, Japan had done it. They'd secured the vast oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. In just a few months, they had completely redrawn the map of Asia. The Axis war machine looked absolutely unstoppable. But just as quickly as that tide had risen, it was about to turn. And the first great reversal of fortune came in the Central Pacific, at a tiny little atoll called Midway. After that incredible string of victories, the Japanese Naval Command got, ambitious. They wanted to finish the job they started at Pearl Harbor. The plan was simple and deadly. Lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap at Midway, destroy them, and secure a defensive perimeter that would be unbreakable for years. The result was the exact opposite of what they planned. It was a combination of flawed Japanese planning and just brilliant American intelligence. They had broken their naval codes. And so the hunters became the hunted. I mean, just look at these numbers. The Japanese fleet lost 4 of its best carriers. The US lost only 1. But this is the crucial part. It was about way more than just ships. Japan lost the irreplaceable core of its veteran naval pilots. With its limited training capacity, this was a blow that the Imperial Japanese Navy could never, ever recover from. Midway wasn't just a defeat. It was the first irreversible Axis disaster of the war. Okay, but the Pacific wasn't the only place the tide was turning. Half a world away, another critical struggle was reaching its climax in the vast deserts of North Africa. You can see on this timeline how the Desert War was this brutal seesaw for almost 2 years, with armies just trading huge stretches of sand back and forth. But in the summer of 1942, the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, pushed his forces deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal itself. The entire British position in the Middle East was hanging by a thread at a place called El Alamein. Well, under their new, very determined commander, General Montgomery, the British basically decided to stop playing Rommel's game of clever maneuvers. Instead, they just opted for a deliberate, grinding fight. They amassed overwhelming superiority in everything: men, tanks, guns. And crucially, Allied forces from Malta choked off Rommel's supply lines, starving his army of fuel and reinforcements. The result wasn't a clever victory, it was a crushing one that ended the Axis threat to Egypt for good. So, the outcomes at both Midway and El Alamein weren't just about battlefield tactics. They reveal the fundamental truth of the war in 1942. These battles were ultimately being decided by the industrial engines humming thousands of miles away from the front lines. And just like Japan, Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was a monumental gamble. He knew he was inviting the world's greatest industrial power into the fight, but he bet that he could crush the Soviet Union before America's factory of democracy could really make a difference. And in doing so, he turned a European war into a global one, and he globalized the industrial mismatch that he was absolutely destined to lose. And this industrial war was far from won at this point. In the Atlantic, 1942 was the single most destructive year for Allied shipping. German U-boats were terrifyingly effective, sinking a staggering almost 7.8 million tons of supplies. But here we go again. The underlying math was turning against the Axis. The sheer productive power of American industry was roaring to life. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a naval conflict anymore. It was a war of production. American shipyards were literally set to build ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and that is a war of attrition the Axis simply could not win. So by the end of 1942, the entire situation had fundamentally changed. The Axis powers had lost the initiative for good, and their foundational gambles had failed spectacularly. The ultimate outcome of the war, it was no longer really in doubt, but the road from El Alamein and Midway to Berlin and Tokyo would still be incredibly long, and it would be paid for with a tremendous, tremendous price in human lives.
Welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We are traveling back to a specific year. A year that, well, if you look at the history books, it really stands out as maybe the most pivotal year in modern history. We're looking at 1942.
It's an absolutely fascinating year to study because it's a year of two completely different realities, really.
Right. If you were standing in, say, London or Washington or Moscow in January of 1942, looking at a map, looking at the headlines, the world looked terrifying.
It was the absolute low point for the Allies. You have to picture it. Germany and Japan, they looked unstoppable. They were rolling over everything.
I mean, the Axis controlled most of Europe. They were deep into Russia.
And Japan had just decimated the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and was just sweeping through Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
If you were a betting person in January 42, you would have put your money on the Axis powers winning.
But then you fast forward. New Year's Eve, 1942. Same year, but the map looks totally different. The momentum has completely reversed.
Exactly. The entire script just flipped.
Yeah. And that's the mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack how 1942 served as this turning of the tide. And we aren't just going to list battles, though we have to talk about some big ones.
No, we want to look at the why. The specific strategic errors and the cold, hard industrial realities that doomed the Axis powers, even while they were technically still winning.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting. It brings up this theme of inevitability that runs through the source material we're looking at.
It really does. We're analyzing a detailed military history. It covers the Pacific, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, and its core argument is that the outcome was determined by factory output and bad strategy long before the shooting actually stopped.
So let's start in the Pacific, because the source material makes a pretty bold claim right off the bat. It basically says the outcome of the Pacific War was decided before the first bomb even dropped on Pearl Harbor. That feels, well, a bit deterministic, doesn't it?
It does sound that way, but when you peel back the layers and look at the industrial disparity, the argument really holds up. At the time, the United States was planning to raise what they called a 1,000-regiment army.
1,000 regiment.
Yeah, they were gearing up to effectively fight the entire world at once.
And Japan.
Japan knew, mathematically, they couldn't compete. The source actually describes their decision to go to war as inexplicable by rational standards. One analyst in the text calls it a kamikaze effort on a national scale.
Wow. Kamikaze effort on a national scale. That implies they knew they were flying into a wall. So if they knew they couldn't win a long war, why start one?
That is the million-dollar question. And the answer is in a very specific piece of naval doctrine called the 7.10 ratio.
Okay, let's unpack that, the 7.10 ratio.
All right. So the Japanese Navy was obsessed with maintaining 70% of the strength of the U.S. Navy. They'd run the war games. They'd done the math. They figured 70% was the absolute minimum they needed to defend the Western Pacific.
So anything below that, and their whole defensive perimeter collapses.
Exactly. But they looked at the American shipbuilding programs that had started in 1940, and they realized, as American factories spun up, that ratio was going to crater. They calculated it would fall to 50% in 1943, and down to a disastrous 30% by 1944.
So it was a closing window, a ticking clock.
Precisely. It was a use it or lose it scenario, a go now or never dilemma. They attacked Pearl Harbor not because they thought they could conquer America, but because they hoped to knock the U.S. down, grab the resources they needed, oil especially, and force a negotiated peace before that industrial tidal wave crashed down on them.
It's terrifyingly logical in a really twisted way. They were trying to short-circuit the war, but obviously that gamble went wrong. Which brings us to Midway.
Midway is the classic pivot point, but what's really interesting here is contrasting the Japanese plan with the American reality. The Japanese plan was incredibly complicated.
Almost too clever for its own good.
Way too clever. It was this Baroque, over-engineered operation. They had forces all over the ocean. Some went to the Aleutians as a distraction. Some were invading. Some were striking.
And it all relied on surprise, right?
Yeah.
They needed the Americans to be reacting blindly.
Yes, but they didn't have surprise. The U.S. was reading their mail, thanks to the codebreakers. They knew the date, the location, the whole plan.
So while Japan is doing this complex dance, the U.S. is just waiting with a baseball bat.
That's a good way to put it. And the result was catastrophic for Japan. They lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu.
4. And going back to that industrial disparity we talked about.
Japan could not replace those ships. Their shipyards were already at capacity. The U.S. could lose a carrier and build 3 more. Japan lost the initiative at Midway and, quite literally, never got it back.
But the source material highlights another battle that might have been even more damaging in the long run, Guadalcanal.
Ah, the meat grinder. This is where the war shifted from these grand naval chess matches to just brutal, bloody attrition.
And this is where the human capital idea comes in. The source points out that at Guadalcanal, Japan didn't just lose ships, they lost pilots.
And that's the critical distinction. You can build a Zero fighter plane in a few weeks. You cannot build an experienced combat pilot in a few weeks.
Right. Japan had this elite cadre of naval aviators.
The best in the world at the start of the war. But at Guadalcanal and the Solomons campaign, Japan lost over 2,000 aviators. These weren't rookies. These were the veterans. The source says they lost their moral ascendancy over the U.S. Navy.
They just couldn't replace that level of skill?
No. Meanwhile, the U.S. pilot training program is essentially an assembly line, churning out thousands of pilots who are good enough. Japan was losing its only experts. It was the beginning of the end for their air arm.
So the Pacific is essentially decided in 1942. Japan gambles, fails at Midway, and then gets bled dry at Guadalcanal. Okay, let's jump across the globe to North Africa.
Very different theater sand, tanks, supply lines. But again, 1942 is the turning point.
And we have to talk about the Rommel myth.
Yeah.
Because everyone's seen the movies, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, this tactical genius who ran circles around the British. But our source is, well, skeptical of that.
Skeptical is putting it mildly. The source suggests a lot of Rommel's early genius was actually just really, really good intelligence.
How so?
Well, it turns out Rommel was relying heavily on a compromised American code. The U.S. military attaché in Cairo was sending these incredibly detailed reports on British positions back to Washington.
And the Axis were reading them.
They were intercepting and decoding every single one. Rommel knew where the British were, their strength, their plans. It's easy to look like a genius when you can see the other guy's cards.
And when that leak was plugged?
His genius suddenly seemed to fade. He started making mistakes. But, to be fair, the source is also quite harsh on the British performance at the time.
Yeah, I saw that. It called the British performance beneath contempt. That's harsh.
It is. But the source argues that the British command turned Rommel into a boogeyman to excuse their own incompetence. There's a startling stat in there. Between 1941 and 1943, British forces in North Africa averaged only 14 German kills a day.
14 a day. That sounds impossibly low.
It sounds it, doesn't it? But it reflects the nature of that war. Vast periods of maneuvering and logistic struggles, punctuated by short, violent battles. It also speaks to a certain, let's say, caution in the British leadership.
But despite all that, the Axis was doomed there too. And again, it comes down to the unsexy stuff. Logistics.
Always logistics. The Axis simply could not supply their armies across the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy and Air Force were just hammering their convoys. The source says they lost 54% of Italian shipping.
54%.
You cannot fight a modern war in the desert if half your fuel and ammo is at the bottom of the sea. Rommel's tanks were constantly running on fumes.
And then comes the squeeze.
Yeah.
Late 1942.
Right. The two-front war in Africa, you have the British winning at El Alamein in Egypt, pushing west. And at the same time, the Americans land in Morocco and Algeria with Operation Torch, pushing east.
The Axis forces are caught in the middle.
Exactly. Germany rushed troops to Tunisia to try and hold the line, but it was hopeless. By the end of 42, the Axis in Africa is finished. It's just a matter of time.
So Pacific is turning. Africa is turning. But the source makes a really important distinction here. It reminds us that while North Africa involved a few divisions, the real war, the one that decided the fate of the world, was on the Eastern Front.
The scale is completely different. We are talking about millions of men. The source is very clear. This is where the war was truly decided.
And 1942 is the year of Stalingrad. But before we get to the city, the German plan. It seems fatally flawed looking back. Operation Blau.
It was. Hitler made a critical mistake. He split his army.
The division of focus.
Yep. He sent one group, Army Group A, south towards the Caucasus Mountains. The goal was oil, economic warfare. They needed that fuel to keep the war machine running.
Which makes sense, logically. Germany was resource-starved.
It does. But then he sent the other group, Army Group B, towards the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad, and they just didn't have the resources for both.
Not even close.
Not even close. By driving for the oil to secure their long-term future, they fatally weakened the military force needed to protect their flank right now. They stretched themselves too thin.
Which leads them into the trap of Stalingrad. The source describes the fighting as Rattenkrieg, rat war.
It's a vivid image. The Germans were masters of mobile warfare tanks, speed, encirclement. But in Stalingrad, they got sucked into room-to-room fighting. In the rubble, the sewers, the basements, it negated all their advantages.
But why? Why did they keep pouring men into it? Why not just bypass it?
It became a battle of prestige. For Hitler, taking the city named after Stalin became an obsession. And for Stalin, holding it was non-negotiable. It stopped being about strategy and started being about ego.
And while the Germans are grinding themselves down in this rat war, the Soviets are planning something massive. Operation Uranus.
This is a masterclass in what the Soviets called maskirovka deception. The source really emphasizes this. The Soviets managed to hide entire armies. They moved at night, used camouflage, total radio silence. The Germans thought the Soviets were on their last legs.
They were wrong.
Very wrong. They were building up a massive counterattack. And here's the tactical brilliance of it. They didn't attack the German panzers in the city head-on. They looked at the map and saw that the German flanks, the long exposed sides of the corridor leading to the city, were held by Romanian troops.
Germany's allies.
Right. And the source notes these Romanian troops lacked heavy anti-tank weapons. They were ill-equipped. So when the Soviets launched their pincer attack, they smashed through those weak flanks like a hammer through glass.
And the result?
Encirclement. They surrounded the entire German 6th Army, 22 divisions.
Trapped. It's the turning point of the turning point.
It absolutely is. And the source touches on one other thing here, a missed political opportunity for Germany.
Oh, right. Their treatment of the civilians.
The source argues that German cruelty to Soviet civilians, the racism, the extermination policies, was a massive strategic error. In 1941, some Soviets, particularly in places like Ukraine, might have seen the Germans as liberators from Stalin.
I mean, Stalin wasn't exactly popular.
No, but the German brutality was so extreme, so absolute, that it just solidified support for Stalin. The people realized they had no choice but to fight to the death. The Germans ensured the Soviet resistance would never break.
So let's zoom out. We've looked at the Pacific, Africa, and Russia. It's December 31st, 1942. What does the world look like now?
It is a completely different world from January. In the Pacific, Japan has lost its best carriers and its best pilots. They're on the defensive. In Africa, the Axis armies are trapped in Tunisia. And in Russia, the German army has suffered a catastrophe at Stalingrad that it will never recover from.
The Great Crusade, as the source puts it, has shifted.
And this connects right back to that industrial theme we started with. This is the so what of it all. The Axis lost their best window of opportunity. They relied on speed and surprise. But by the end of 1942, that window slammed shut.
Because from 1943 onward, the factories take over.
Exactly. American and Soviet production simply overwhelms them. It becomes a war of attrition that the Axis cannot mathematically win. 1942 was the year they had to win it, and they didn't.
It really reframes how you view the rest of the war. It's not just a series of battles. It's a slow, inevitable crushing.
It is. The outcome was written in 1942. The rest was just the bloody execution of that sentence.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with this one thought that really stuck with me. The source mentions how Western history often glorifies specific commanders, like Rommel, or focuses on these specific heroic stands.
Right. We love the great man theory of history. It's cleaner. It's a better story.
But the source suggests this is often just PR. It masks systemic failures. It covers up things like British incompetence in Africa or the sheer staggering scale of Soviet sacrifice that we can barely comprehend.
It raises a really provocative question, you know. How much of our popular understanding of World War II is just public relations, covering up the cold, hard math of industrial slaughter? We talk about genius generals, but maybe we should be talking about factory output and logistics tables.
Something to mull over next time you watch a war movie. That's it for this deep dive into 1942. Thanks for listening.